Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Asha Kothari Chaudhary and I'm a professor of English at Guwahati University. We are doing a course on Indian writing in English and we are looking at a module today which talks about new experimentations in Indian English poetry, and the themes that we are tracking in this module are miscellaneous themes. Let us look first of all at the work of Arun Balkrishna Kolatkar, who is from Maharashtra, Kolhapur to be precise. He was born in 1932 and he has this profile of being a prolific bilingual writer who has published his works both in Marathi and in English. His first volume of poems in English, the very well-known Jejuri, is a collection of 31 poems and speak of his visit to a place in Jejuri in Maharashtra with his brother in 1963. Arun Kolatkar's poetry evokes a series of images to highlight the ambiguities of modern life. His Marathi verses, like his English compositions, reflect the quintessential modernist in him, basically perhaps due to his adaptation of the stylistic features of European avant-garde movements like Surrealism, Expressionism, and even the Beat generation poetry happens to be a kind of influence. He was trained as an artist from the JJ School of Art in Mumbai, and therefore the visual element in his work is also to be noted. In the poem called Traffic Lights that we are focusing upon right now, we have Kolatkar ingenuously highlighting the dilemma brought about by the rules set for the minister's convoy, which disrupts the normalcy of the traffic in cities. The poem illustrates the rowdy nature of governmental authorities represented by, quote unquote, the deathly white Mercedes. The adjective phantom indicates the speaker's envisioning of the black cats or the commandos entrusted with the responsibility of the security of the ministers or bureaucrats and to save them from death itself. The poem is both a biting commentary on the Indian political standards as well as an indictment of the mentality of the general masses who fail to question it. In Pie Dog, another poem, we have a long, rambling, and this being a Kolatkar poem, also a very disturbing one. Kolatkar does not focus on one single theme in this Pie Dog. On the contrary, he uses variegated nature of Indian life, which are depicted in a specific kind of a vision. He makes a salad bowl come alive by bringing in a wide tapestry of divergent themes like Indian mythology, cartography, geography, history, Vedic tradition, ecology, social principles, and so on. The dog considers his visage as resembling the 17th century map of Mumbai or Bombay. It brings in the modern reference of Harlan Ellison's science fantasy to an extent. The boldest venture of Kolatkar is really in the sphere of investing the speaker with the ability to utter the Gayatri mantra. Kolatkar tries to suggest here that there is a kind of corollary between the inanimate world and that of the living. The poem ends with the speaker's inability to digest the smell of lavender, the acidic perspiration, nail polish, rosewood, and raisin, which explodes in his brain. All these images suggest the coming back of the city traffic to life. Please note that all of these images are smell images. They are olfactory images, in other words. The term surrender should be taken note of because it highlights the royal delusion of the dog to be the master of the city at night. Pie Dog, like many of other Arun Kolatkar poems, is very often reflective of the fact that there is a certain sense of power, a certain sense of irreverence that informs all of this particular poet's works. Moving on into the work of Imtiaz Dharker, who we have considered in earlier modules in terms of gender, in terms of the politics of identity, we look now in this module at certain other strands in her work. Imtiaz Dharker was born in 1954 at Lahore, and her anthologies, her body of work, include The Parda and Other Stories in 1988, Postcards from God in 1997, I Speak for the Devil in 2001, and The Terrorist at My Table at 2006. In the poem entitled The Right Word, Dharker dwells extensively upon the paranoia of modern Indians in considering the identity of a stranger. The poem also harps upon the ability or difficulty in ascribing the right word to identify a stranger who, in the worst case scenario, may be a terrorist or a hostile militant. The speaker laments on the genial nature of humanity, which is now reluctant to take for granted the traditional custom of Atithi Devo Bhava. The poem begins with the speaker's discovery of a stranger in the shadows who, by extension, may be a terrorist or a hostile militant, a freedom fighter or a guerrilla warrior. The speaker adopts an optimistic stance and deliberately takes the risk of inviting the stranger. The nervousness of the boy to enter the house is suggested by the ironical implication of the image of steady hands. The poem thus, by extension, can be seen as an invitation made by Dharker to all Indians to let go the bias and parochial mentality in considering the identity of a stranger and to accord dignity instead. However, one must note that she has explored to a great extent the ambiguities of such a position, the borderlines of such a situation where a host is almost always going to be suspicious because of specific reasons of stability or instability in the world that we inhabit. Let us now move on to examine some other strands in the works of Nissim Ezekiel, whose work also we have had occasion to talk about in previous modules. Ezekiel was born to a Bene Israeli family in 1924. He was educated at Wilson College, Bombay, and went to England to study philosophy at Birkbeck College. Among his several volumes of poetry, we have A Time to Change in 1952, 60 poems in 1953, The Third in 1959, The Unfinished Man in 1960, The Exact Name in 1965, Hymns in Darkness 1976, and finally The Collected Poems in 1989. Ezekiel makes a precise use of the English language and its improvisational standard with the novel use of Babu English. His thematic preoccupation is with the human sexuality, alienation, and identity. These are the strands that we are going to be examining in the poem that we have at hand, which is called Very Indian Poem in English. In this poem, Ezekiel takes strong exception to the evils that have disrupted the very fabric of the socio-cultural milieu, which in turn have jeopardized the identity of India as a nation. The poem then is an embodiment of the uncertainty looming large regarding the future prospects of India as a nation contingent to racial, sexual, political, and cultural diversities. Ezekiel's assertion of his belief in Gandhian philosophies is also one of the admirably sketched out ideas in the poem. He takes a sly dig at the Indian frenzy for foreign things and for foreignness, and also highlights the poet's call for a spiritual renaissance. The speaker tries to project an entire state languishing in disarray. The craze for westernization has dealt a severe blow to the traditional belief system of the Indians, and the poem pinpoints the ideological difference between the inculcation of ancient Indian wisdom and the evils imported from the West. To Ezekiel, India's position in the international arena with regard to her relation with neighboring countries does not show any sign of promise. The poet's assertion that Ram Rajya is surely coming is in fact quite ironical, as it serves to mock the clamor for Ram Rajya, which invested interests have used in order to sow the seeds of communal violence and petty political ends. Also to be noted about a very Indian poem in English is one very obvious thing. This is a poem that makes a very humorous dig at the various types of accentuation that Indians are prone to have. And having done that, he also explores the other eccentricities of identity and other miscellaneous themes in this poem that we have already talked about. In The Railway Clerk, Ezekiel consciously upholds the Indian sensibility by showcasing the deteriorating financial standards of a railway clerk. The general economic condition does not tally with the standard of living. The poem unfolds with the occupational hazard of the speaker in getting his leave sanctioned, and the neglectful attitude of his children for studies is a testimony to his financial hardship. So these are the two poems that we have considered in this module from Ezekiel, and they are in some ways dissimilar, and that is what we are trying to track here, that the speaking voice and the themes that unfold in many of the poems that we are going to look at in another section following this are not constrained in specificities of one single kind of a trajectory. They move from one thematic concern to another. Moving on to the next strand that we explore in the poem called Hunger by Jayanta Mahapatra, whose work we have already looked at in so many of our previous modules. And he is one of the most important poetic voices in Indian writing in English in our time. And he was born in 1928 and lived in Cuttack in Odisha, and has to his name a voluminous corpus, amongst which are The False Start and The Relationship in 1980, in Life Science in 1983, The Temple in 1987, A Whiteness of the Bone in 1992, and so on. Hunger is a poem about the primordial sexual cravings attained in lieu of money that has long been the characteristic trait of humanity since civilization came upon us. While the poem is about the desperate urge of the male body to gratify its hunger by mating with its female body, it is also an exploration of the deeper levels of understanding that may be attained by both the fisherman and his daughter in the poem. While on the one hand, the speaker experiences an uncontrollable desire for sexual gratification, on the other hand, he also undergoes the experience of a sense of guilt about his carnal desires. The obnoxious image of a father who offers his daughter to visitors. You have the expression, quote, "I felt the hunger there," unquote, is a testimony to the visitor's painful awareness and realization of the different forms of hunger that has brought them together inside the shack. The irony, therefore, lies in the difference of the hunger between the visitor and the fisherman's daughter. Hunger of the flesh in the case of the former, and hunger of the belly in the case of the latter. The poem is by far a vivid representation of how women are made figures of patriarchal fantasies and male victimization. The poem aptly demonstrates Mahapatra's adroitness in exposing and juxtaposing two animal instincts, the hunger for food and the hunger for sex. So in this module, what we have been looking at is miscellaneous strands, miscellaneous issues, miscellaneous themes that occur in various poets. And these are poets that have also been read in previous modules, where we have been trying to track specific kinds of thematic concerns, specific kinds of tropes that seem to inform much of their poetry. For example, we have looked at the ideas of history, of nation, of politics, of gender, of community, and so on and so forth in many of the other poems that we did in earlier modules. But in this module, we keep looking at certain diverse materials ambiguously placed, not equivocally about specific kinds of one strand or theme or trope that will define its meaning or its trajectory, but miscellaneous inputs that come and give the texture of the poem a very definitively ambiguous kind of space. And that is where the interest of these pieces that we have considered lies. So in this module, what we have been trying to do is we have been trying to take random miscellaneous ideas that come into the work of poets like Kolatkar or Ezekiel or Mahapatra or Imtiaz Dharker. And all of these are poets that we have also referred to in previous modules, where we have tried to track specific tropes such as nationalism or politics or identity or the idea of home or memory that inform specific poems by these poets. However, it is not always true that the poets will stick to one specific area or thematic concern. And what we are trying to do in this module is that we are trying to take little wisps of whimsical concerns, sometimes issues that are very strongly highlighted in other poems, and see how they work in tandem with each other. Say, for example, we have the paranoia of a modern man who is brilliantly etched in a poem, and you find the responsive reasoning that is emanating in the assessment of a stranger due to the present terrorist-prone world in the work of Imtiaz Dharker, for example, or the humorous vein in which you have the evocation of the idea of Ram Rajya, so current even in our own times, where you have to simply smile at the syntactical formations that Ezekiel deliberately evokes in order to get home to us of the spoken, the phonetic enunciations of the way in which Indians really speak. So a very Indian poem in English is also a poem which you can read and find fun and laugh at its content, because it is so obviously invested with the speaking voice itself. The other little strands that we might look at, say for example, are what can we make of the pie dog, where you have possible interpretations of Kolatkar's idea of investing the dog with a thorough knowledge of the Vedas and its easy recital of the Gayatri Mantra. So these are interesting little things that keep coming to us, which cannot really be pigeonholed into specific kinds of modular structure that we might need to track only one kind of thematic idea, because this is a poem that sort of spreads itself out and works out its focus with an imagistic idea of the dog who speaks and speaks in a most educated fashion. Among some of the strands that we are looking at in this plethora of different types of miscellaneous ideas that are thrown in this module that we have for you is also the idea of sexuality. While we have ideas of nature that also rope in ideas of sexuality, here we have it in terms of, say, the poem like Hunger, which we have just read by Mahapatra. This is a poem where you will find that identity, again, is shaped by the idea of sexuality, and sexuality itself is not seen as a standalone idea. It too overlaps with the economics of poverty, the idea of patriarchy, the notion that a woman will have to be able to cope with the mostly male hunger that we have in the poems. You'll find that sexuality in some sense is also a theme that is dominant in the work of Kolatkar, whose poems that we have read in this particular module. But however, the poems that we have read do not directly make references to sexuality in the manner that Mahapatra's poems, particularly this poem, Hunger, does. So in this module, we have discussed ideas of sexuality, of humorous poetry, of Indian accents in a very Indian English poem by Ezekiel, for example, or the notion of hospitality, of tradition, of modernity in the poems by Kolatkar, by Imtiaz Dharker, by Jayanta Mahapatra, and Nissim Ezekiel. Thank you.